In the brutal mechanized clashes of World War II, infantrymen required dedicated firepower to pierce advancing enemy armor. Today we rank and explain every major anti-materiel and anti-tank rifle deployed during this devastating global conflict. Prepare for a highly detailed catalog of the most definitive armor-piercing shoulder-fired weapons of the era. Sholokhov PTR is where we begin our list. An early Soviet single-shot bolt-action rifle chambered for the 12.7mm armor-piercing cartridge. It represented the initial Soviet attempt to provide infantry squads with a dedicated anti-armor capability before the massive German invasion. Only a very limited number of prototypes and initial production models were ever manufactured, before military planners deemed its armor penetration completely insufficient. Consequently, it saw virtually no widespread frontline combat use during the heavily mechanized battles of World War II. The weapon suffered from poor ergonomics and lacked the muzzle velocity required to threaten anything beyond light reconnaissance vehicles. Nevertheless, this extremely rare firearm laid the crucial conceptual groundwork for the much more famous Soviet anti-tank rifles that successfully followed. Rukavishnikov M1939 is next, representing the Soviet Union's first major attempt at a semi-automatic anti-tank rifle chambered for the powerful 14.5mm round. Engineered by Nikolai Rukavishnikov, this complex gas-operated weapon offered a significant theoretical advantage in rate of fire over manual bolt-action designs. However, the sophisticated internal mechanism proved highly unreliable and extremely susceptible to jamming when exposed to standard battlefield dirt and debris. Production was notoriously slow, resulting in only a few hundred units reaching the Red Army before manufacturing was abruptly canceled in 1940. Although a handful were desperately deployed during the early days of the German invasion, the design was ultimately deemed a strategic military failure. The harsh tactical lessons learned from its mechanical shortcomings directly influenced the simpler and far more robust weapons adopted later by the Soviet military. Oerlikon SSG36 is what we have moving forward. A Swiss-engineered anti-tank rifle that utilized a heavy 20mm cartridge to defeat early light armor. This weapon was developed primarily for lucrative export markets during the interwar period and saw limited adoption by several smaller European nations. It operated on an advanced blowback mechanical system, which required an incredibly heavy recoil spring and made the firearm exceedingly difficult to cock manually under stress. The sheer overall weight and physical bulk of the platform made it notoriously cumbersome for a standard infantry squad to transport effectively across rough European terrain. Despite these severe tactical drawbacks, its large explosive projectile offered devastating post-penetration effects against lightly armored vehicles and fortified enemy pillboxes. Ultimately, the rapid thickening of global tank armor during World War II quickly rendered this heavy Swiss weapon completely tactically obsolete. Panzerbüchse 38 is next, allowing us to continue with this complex German design that introduced the high-velocity 7.9 2mm armor-piercing round to the battlefield. This weapon featured a unique semi-automatic breech mechanism where the barrel recoiled to eject the spent casing and lock open for the next round. While mathematically brilliant in its engineering, this intricate system proved highly sensitive to the mud and grit commonly found in standard combat conditions. Production facilities manufactured approximately 1,400 of these rifles before the complex machining requirements forced a complete halt to the assembly lines. German infantrymen utilized the surviving units extensively during the successful invasions of Poland and France before replacing them entirely with simpler models. It remains a fascinating historical textbook example of German over-engineering applied to a relatively simple infantry anti-armor combat requirement. Type 97 20mm anti-tank rifle is next on our list, an incredibly heavy Japanese weapon that functioned more like a light artillery piece than a standard infantry rifle. This massive gas-operated semi-automatic firearm fired a highly destructive 20mm high explosive or specialized armor-piercing tracer shell. Because the weapon weighed over 150 pounds, it required a dedicated heavy weapons team of 4 men to carry it, using specially designed steel transport handles. The sheer concussive force and violent physical recoil of the platform earned it a fearsome reputation among the Japanese soldiers assigned to operate it. It saw extensive combat use across the Pacific theater, proving highly effective against American landing craft, light transport vehicles, and fortified defensive positions. However, it was completely useless against the thick sloped frontal armor of the American M4 Sherman medium tanks encountered heavily later in the war. Boy's anti-tank rifle is what we have here. serving as the primary infantry anti-armor weapon of the British Empire during the early stages of World War II. This incredibly robust bolt-action rifle fired a specialized 0.55 caliber armor-piercing round designed specifically to defeat interwar tank designs. British and Commonwealth forces deployed it heavily during the desperate Battle of France and the early mechanized campaigns across the North African deserts. While highly effective against early Italian and German light tanks, the steel projectile completely failed to penetrate the upgraded frontal plates of later Panzer variants. Soldiers heavily criticized the weapon for its punishing physical recoil, often stating in combat reports that it was nearly as dangerous to the shooter as the target. By 1943, the British military entirely phased out this legendary bolt-action rifle in favor of the much more effective rocket-firing infantry anti-tank projector. 39M Nehézpuska is what we have moving along. A highly effective Hungarian anti-Materiel rifle that is also commonly known around the world as the Solothurn license, built in Nuvia. This weapon was a direct engineering copy of the Swiss Solothurn design, firing a powerful 20mm cartridge from a 5-round detachable box magazine. Hungarian forces utilized this massive semi-automatic rifle primarily to support infantry units against lightly armored Soviet reconnaissance vehicles and fortified machine gun nests. Due to its extreme physical weight, gun crews frequently mounted the weapon on a small wheeled towing carriage to transport it safely into active combat zones. The complex recoil-operated mechanism required meticulous daily cleaning to maintain operational reliability during the brutal freezing conditions of the Eastern Front. Ultimately, while devastating against soft targets, it shared the universal fate of all anti-tank rifles and lost its tactical effectiveness against heavily armored medium tanks. Karabin Przeciwlotniczy Panzerbüchse M1939 is next, letting us proceed with this highly secretive Polish anti-tank rifle that utilized a completely revolutionary approach to armor penetration. Instead of utilizing a hardened steel core, this advanced bolt-action weapon fired a specially designed lead core bullet at the incredibly high velocity of over 4,000 feet per second. Upon striking enemy armor, the soft projectile flattened out and transferred immense kinetic energy, causing the interior armor plate to spall and violently eject lethal shrapnel into the crew compartment. The Polish military kept this weapon under absolute strict secrecy, shipping it to combat units in sealed wooden crates deliberately falsely labeled as advanced surveillance equipment. During the 1939 invasion, it proved highly capable of knocking out any German light tank deployed on the battlefield at standard combat ranges. Following the tragic fall of Poland, the German military captured thousands of these excellent rifles and aggressively reissued them to their own frontline infantry units. Panzerbüchse 39 is next, representing the simplified manual successor to the earlier German model designed specifically for rapid mass production at the outbreak of World War II. This reliable breech-loading rifle fired the exact same high-velocity 7.92mm cartridge as its highly complex semi-automatic predecessor. Engineers completely eliminated the complicated recoiling barrel system, resulting in a significantly lighter, much more reliable, and easily manufactured frontline combat weapon. German infantry squads relied heavily on this specific rifle during the massive invasion of the Soviet Union to successfully combat early Russian light tanks and armored cars. However, as advancing Soviet forces introduced the heavily armored T-34 tank in massive numbers, this weapon completely lost its tactical anti-armor capability. Consequently, the German military eventually recalled thousands of these obsolete rifles from the front line and brilliantly converted them into dedicated grenade-launching platforms. Panzerbüchse M.SS.41 is what we have here, an extremely unique and innovative anti-tank rifle developed in occupied Czechoslovakia, specifically for the German Waffen SS divisions. This weapon was the world's first successful operational bullpup anti-tank rifle, placing the action and magazine completely behind the trigger group to drastically reduce the overall combat length. It fired the standard German 7.92mm armor-piercing round from a side-mounted box magazine, providing a rapid manual rate of fire for the operator. To cycle the complex action, the operator physically pushed the entire pistol grip forward and pulled it backward, completely eliminating the need for a traditional bolt handle. This incredibly compact and highly maneuverable design made it vastly superior for intense urban combat environments compared to the incredibly long standard German rifles. Despite its brilliant modern layout and ergonomic advantages, it unfortunately suffered the exact same tactical obsolescence as all other small-caliber anti-armor weapons by 1942. Solothurn S-18 100 is next. allowing us to examine this heavy 20mm semi-automatic anti-tank rifle developed in Switzerland under the covert financial backing of the German Rheinmetall Corporation. This reliable weapon operated on a short recoil system and utilized a sturdy 5 or 10 round detachable box magazine loaded horizontally from the left receiver side. The heavy armor-piercing projectile possessed enough kinetic energy to completely shatter the engine blocks of enemy transport vehicles and successfully penetrate light interwar tanks. Several Axis-aligned nations, prominently including Italy and Hungary, aggressively purchased these heavy rifles to heavily bolster the anti-armor capabilities of their standard infantry divisions. The massive physical overall size and bone-jarring manual recoil made it an exceptionally difficult weapon to deploy effectively from a strictly concealed fighting position. Its relatively low operational muzzle velocity ultimately prevented it from defeating the upgraded heavy armor plating utilized on Allied tanks during the later developmental years of the war. Solothurn S-18 1000 and 1100 is how we continue our catalog, featuring the heavily upgraded tactical variants of the previous Swiss design. These massive weapons chamber a significantly longer and much more powerful 20mm cartridge to drastically increase the overall muzzle velocity and armor penetration characteristics. The 1100 variant specifically featured a selective fire capability, allowing the military operator to unleash fully automatic fire for use as a dedicated anti-aircraft weapon. Because these upgraded platforms were incredibly heavy and physically taxing, military units almost exclusively deployed them mounted on small-wheeled towing carriages rather than carrying them by hand. They saw widespread combat service with the Italian armed forces and the German military, who utilized them to effectively suppress fortified bunkers and engage light armored vehicles. Despite the massive strategic increase in ballistic power, they still completely failed to penetrate heavy Allied tanks, definitively proving that the era of the anti-tank rifle was ending. Lahti L39 is next, representing this massive Finnish 20mm semi-automatic rifle famously known among its operators as the legendary elephant gun. Designed by the famous engineer Imo Lahti, this incredibly robust gas-operated weapon was engineered specifically to function flawlessly in the freezing sub-zero temperatures of the Winter War. It aggressively fired an extremely powerful 20mm projectile that easily pierced the hardened armor of early Soviet light tanks and heavily armored personnel carriers. During the intense, brutal combat of the Continuation War, Finnish soldiers highly valued this heavy weapon for long-range precision sniping against Soviet bunkers, machine gun nests, and even low-flying aircraft. The immense physical recoil was somewhat mitigated by a massive, tuned muzzle brake and heavily padded leather shoulder rest, though it remained incredibly punishing to the user. Today, it proudly stands as a legendary historical testament to Finnish military engineering and remains one of the most visually recognizable heavy rifles of World War II. PTR-D41 is what we have here, representing one of the most famous and widely produced anti-tank rifles in human history, brilliantly designed by Vasily Dagaryov. This incredibly simple single-shot bolt-action rifle aggressively fired the absolutely devastating 14.5mm tungsten-cored armor-piercing round. The clever operational bolt mechanism automatically unlatched and partially extracted the spent brass casing during the recoil stroke, significantly increasing the manual reloading speed for the stressed operator. The desperate Soviet Union rapidly manufactured over 400,000 of these cheap and highly reliable rifles to completely equip retreating infantry units during the massive German invasion. While entirely incapable of directly penetrating the thick frontal armor of a German Tiger or Panther tank, Soviet snipers aggressively targeted the highly vulnerable side tracks, vision slits, and optical periscopes. This extremely robust weapon remained in heavy continuous frontline service until the very final bloody days of World War II, serving highly effectively as an urban anti-materiel rifle. PTR-S-41 is where we finally conclude our catalog, presenting the gas-operated semi-automatic counterpart to the previous rifle that was brilliantly designed by Sergei Simonov. This highly advanced weapon utilized the exact same 14.5mm heavy cartridge, but fed from a 5-round internal magazine cleanly loaded via an AUK clip. The rapid semi-automatic action allowed a highly skilled Soviet gunner to unleash devastating follow-up shots against rapidly moving German armored vehicles before they could safely retreat. However, the complex internal gas system was incredibly physically sensitive to the massive carbon fouling produced by the heavy ammunition, requiring absolutely meticulous and continuous daily cleaning. Despite this slight operational reliability issue, the weapon successfully proved incredibly highly effective against lightly armored personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery guns, and heavily reinforced concrete bunkers. The highly ingenious operating mechanism of this legendary World War II weapon later successfully served as the direct mechanical foundation for the world-famous SKS semi-automatic carbine.